Bebe. Well, first, how did you get the name Bebe?
When I was a baby, less than a year old, and trying to talk, which has sort of been my life, I couldn't say Betty Ann, which was like a mouthful. And so I called myself, and I guess I was trying to say baby.
Yeah.
And so it came out as Bebe. And fortunately, it really stuck.
Yeah. So you really came out as Betty Ann.
I
You
did.
changed it to Bebe as a young age. Well, let's go back. 1938, Boston, Massachusetts. Let's go back. What do you remember when you were just a little girl?
Oh, I have a lot of memories of Boston. The neighborhood that we lived in is not Jewish. We lived in a sort of blue-collar, lower-middle-class Jewish community. And we lived in an apartment building, nothing huge, like maybe 6. And I don't remember if everybody was Jewish, but I suspect that they were. And the Sternbergs, with their 3 boys and 1 daughter, lived upstairs, and they were like they were a second family. My mother had some vision problems that made it difficult for her, and Mrs. Sternberg, God bless her, was the kind of person who just came in and did it. Whatever it was, she came in and she was a fount of common sense. Whereas in my family, there was a bit of a lack of that. So she's just such a wonderful human being.
Well, now tell me about your folks. Tell me about your dad. What did he do?
Well, my father had a really fascinating, but terribly sad history. His father came from Russia at the time of the pogroms, but I think it was also an attempt to avoid conscription into the army.
Right.
Okay. And his particular talent was horses. So when the horses came in from the West, he would meet them and he would break them to become dray horses or, cart horses or whatever. And interestingly enough, my father had a scar down the side of his face because he was kicked in the head by a horse when he ran into the street. So that was, when I go to Boston and I see what Boston is like that, and I think, oh. So his mother died, we think, in the flu epidemic.
Back in Russia?
No, here in America.
Okay.
And she was an amazing lady in that, I told you my father had all this wonderful raw energy. Well, I think he got it from his mother because she was one of the ladies who was known by first name at City Hall. And there was a scandal that the kosher butchers weren't selling kosher meat, and my grandmother led the parade, to protest this. So, and she had, sometimes I lose track, she either had 5 or 6 children, and my father was square in the middle. And she died. And I don't remember exactly how old my father was, but he was very young. And I don't think he ever got beyond the 8th grade. And my grandfather did what men did. He married very quickly because he needed somebody to help with these children. And the woman he married wanted no part of them. So my father was really abandoned at a very young age and taken in by a friend of his who lived in Connecticut. And this friend who lived in Connecticut was in love with a woman in New York who was my mother's first cousin, and so they double dated, and that was the story. That's how it happened. My father was an interesting man in that he was the least materialistic person you will ever meet. And my sister and I love to sort of laugh, but maybe not so much, that Boston during the war, during World War II, was a center for the Navy, and ships were in and out. And my father's company that he did not own they had the contract to do some of the laundry for the ships. By that time he was in the laundry business. So what we love to laugh about is that my father was probably the only Jew in Boston who made nothing from this. And out of World War II came Jewish millionaires from dealing with the black market and doing all of this. And what was important about that was that they then left Roxbury.
Right,
You think about Roxbury and Dorchester as Boston's Lower East Side. And so now people had money and they left, except the Epsteins didn't. And Boston was a perfect example of something called white flight, where unscrupulous developers came in, frightened people, bought land, bought houses at much lower rates. And forgive me for this, but this is just the history. And their stick was African Americans are coming. They're coming up from Blue Hill Avenue. So it was really very sad because this was a protected, wonderful Jewish community where children played on the streets till 6, 7 o'clock at night. And it in some ways, for a young child, it was idyllic.
Now, did your dad ever talk to you about coming over to the United States?
He was born in Boston.
Oh, he was born in Boston.
Yeah.
Your grandparents that came over.
It's my grandparents who came over. And as we like to laugh, my father was born on Friday the 13th in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, you don't get better than that, you know.
Yeah. Now, did your grandparents ever talk about that journey?
My grandparents died long. I don't think my grandfather actually outlived his wife very long. So my father was really on his own.
Yeah. What about your grandparents on your mom's side?
I have wonderful memories of my grandparents on my mother's side. When my mother and father married, my mother left Brookline and this huge family, and I think she was probably delighted, and moved with him to Boston. Well, as my father would say, my grandmother, who was a remarkable human being, felt that her daughter was on loan, and every now and then she would call the loan in. So it was always a point of real contention between my father and his mother-in-law, who he did not love. My grandmother was, as there were in many families, immigrant families, she was, I'm not really quite sure where she was from Lithuania, Poland, because the boundaries kept changing and who knew anything. But my father, when he wanted to tease my mother, would call her a Litvak or a Galiciano, you know, and I was never clear on what. My parents in the house, when they didn't want us to understand what was going on, spoke Yiddish.
Right.
And what was really sad, but neither one of them had accents because they were both born here. What's really sad is that gone. You know, I can still recognize some of it. So my grandmother was the one who held the family together, and that was her job. She had sisters and brothers, all of whom were sort of, you know, doing fairly well. My grandmother was the rock of the family. And she married my grandfather and was a very unhappy, it was an unhappy marriage.
Right.
We would go to Brookline to visit my grandmother, and this was during the war. My grandfather would be listening to the radio, and he would be listening to Gabriel Heater. And if you can ever hear any of those old recordings, this man was incredible. And while my grandfather was listening, my sister and I were sitting behind him. He was on the radio, and my grandmother was berating him in Yiddish from the time the program started to the time the program ended. And they lived in apartments in Brooklyn that were all Jewish, and so we knew all the neighbors. I mean, you know, we were a little bit part of that community too. And then my grandfather died, and I just want to say that my grandmother, her part of the family was she cleaned houses, she babysat. My grandmother did whatever it took to bring money in the house. There was no concern about self, about status, or I mean, that was so beyond wherever my grandmother went. My grandmother and her sisters reminded me very much when Woody Allen did I guess it was Hannah and her sisters, or was it Annie Hall when he goes back into the family? And I was very angry at the time because he distorts them. But in their own way, they were a little bizarre. I mean, my grandchildren would look like this. Who are these people? But there was I guess the best way I can say it, I grew up with a very strong sense of Yiddishkeit.
Yeah.
And it has stayed with me forever. And I'm very drawn to books about early history of Jews in America, very drawn to the Holocaust, to anything that I can read. And I just finished, my father had this wonderful, he would have been a marvelous comedian in the Borscht Belt and singer. And he would take me as a very young child down to the Lower East Side. And he would talk in Yiddish to the pickle lady and the schmaltz lady and the herring lady, and we would go from that in those days it was on the street, and they would think that he was the genuine article, that he had just recently come over. And I was enthralled, as I still am. We're going to New York in 2 weeks, and we're going to Lower East Side. And I'll never forget one lady, he always took me as his, side person. And one lady said, in Yiddish and in English, it's always the daughters and the father. And I love to tell that story now because this lady never knew who Sigmund Freud was.
Now, your grandparents on your mom's side, were they born here? Or
Oh, no.
Where did they come from?
Well, I'm not sure where my grandfather came from. That's what I said earlier, something about whether or not my grandmother came from Lithuania or whatever. When my grandmother came over on the ship, she came with her cousin, and her cousin's name was Miriam. Well, that was my grandmother's name. And the customs or the inspector, whoever he was, said, no, we're not going to have two Miriams. So you, pointing to my grandmother, are Mary. So in those days, a Jewish Mary was extremely unusual, but we got one in Brooklyn. When my grandmother came to Boston, she would come with treasures. Not that I thought they were, because I didn't. And one of them was her rugula. And she made a yeast rising yet rugula because it was kosher and it could be parb. And she would bake me comforters, puffs, we called them, made with down and all of that. To this day, I have to sleep under something that has some weight. And that was my grandmother's puff. Several years ago, a long time ago, after I married, moved to Dallas, had the third child, right? 2 other children are adopted. They were the children from my husband's first marriage. And sadly, his wife died, and she was a very close friend of mine. So I was living in New York. I had a master's in social work. I was working in a hospital setting in the Bronx that I dearly loved. And my mother said to me, you don't have to go to Europe every year. You could come to Dallas. And the reason she sort of said it that way was because as a hospital employee, I was eligible for HIP, which was a health insurance plan, and we had dirt cheap airfares to Europe. So I reconnected with my husband, who was an old friend, fell in love, madly in love with his 2 children, and we married. So
What year was that?
we married in 69. Yeah, okay. And then we had together a third child, and their first names all begin with M, because it was cheaper that way, is how we like to say it. So, and we, worked very hard to establish a family life. There were a lot of challenges. We had my mother and father, his mother and father, and then we had, unfortunately, his first wife, who was a wonderful human being's parents. And they were not people who wished us well. They just loved to make life difficult for us. So I went to work when my youngest was about 8 or 9 months. Worked several years in 2 or 3 different agencies. Finally, two of the agencies, MHMR, were part-time. But Hope Cottage, which was then an adoption and child service agency here, was a full-time position, and I rose to be vice president. But boards in those days were status symbols, and so it wasn't a board committed to the welfare of children. It was a board committed to status. So I decided I couldn't do this anymore when the president of the board said, "You know what a Cadillac is? It's a Jewish Jeep." And I thought, I'm out of here. I am so out of here. So then I went to other agencies. I was in charge of at Dallas Association for Retarded Citizens. And then finally I decided I can't stand these people. Coming from the Bronx and Montefiore Hospital, which was a teaching hospital, it was just really too much. I couldn't do it.
Well, let's go back a little ways now. We jumped ahead. Where did you go to high school?
I went to Brookline High School, Brookline, Massachusetts.
And what was high school life like?
Well, remember I told you about white flight? Well, sadly enough, we left the neighborhood and moved to Brookline. And my father's business had gone down the tubes, and it was very difficult. That's when he came to Dallas because he has a sister here. He had a sister here. So I was in the Roxbury Memorial High School for Girls, which was a wonderful school, and then I went to Brookline High School in my senior year. And if you want a disaster happening, you move a kid, you know. So, and it was a very different environment. But the environment, it was more sort of upwardly mobile. Yeah. Brookline was a much more high-status neighborhood, and in many ways I should have commuted and gone back to, because that's where all my friends were, and that's where I really felt the most comfortable. I was a very shy kid.
Now, after high school, did you go on to college, or did you go to work?
By that time, we'd moved to Dallas, and I had the distinct pleasure of being one of 3 girls, Jewish girls at SMU. Oh, I cannot even begin to tell you about the little red beanies and the sororities that didn't accept Jews. It made Brookline look wonderful. But, I graduated from SMU and managed to get a really decent education. I graduated as an English major, got a teaching certificate, and was interviewed by the head of the Dallas Independent School District, who I'm very proud to say wouldn't hire me. And the reason, for a lot of reasons, and I don't think it was anti-Semitism specifically, but it had to do with the fact that I was I am what is known as a yellow dog Democrat, with very strong, this is one of the things that led me to social work, very idealistic values that I hold very dear today, having to do with how I see the world and how I see people. And I suspect that I communicated that.
Well, how did World War II affect your family? You were just a little girl.
Boston was out there. And there were subs. Boston was targeted. We never had enough money to own a house, but we would go to Boston. Was so beautiful. It still is. The environs. It just still is. And in Gloucester, which is where we went one summer and rented a little cottage, there were sightings of the submarines. The German subs were all over. And so, people were scared to let your children alone in the water, like the sub is going to come up and grab you. So it was just a fact of daily living. Every night the blinds came down. We were in total blackout. In school, we did all the stuff. I mean, we collected money, we collected cans, we collected everything. We looked like little birds, carrying all of these bundles to school. Boston Public School was also where I got my first dose of true anti-Semitism. It came in two ways. First of all, in order to teach in the Boston Public School, you had to be Catholic, and you had to be a maiden lady. If you were married, gone. So a lot of the teachers really were kind of like nuns, and with very specific beliefs. So here comes this little frightened Jewish girl whose name is Betty Ann Epstein. And the nuns say, no, that's not your name. Oh, it's not my name. Your name is Elizabeth. Betty Ann is a kind of a whatever, but the formal name is Elizabeth. I went home and I said, well, what am I? Am I Elizabeth or am I Betty Ann? So my mother, I'm sure, trudged up to school and said, no, her name really is Betty Ann. And my name is Betty Ann because I'm named for my paternal grandmother, whose name was Brookline. And that was as close as they could get. Second time was when one of my little classmates, very early on, probably before the second grade, said, are you Jewish? I said, yeah. He said, you killed Christ. Well, I mean, I didn't know who Christ was. And so again, back home and everything, I said, Mom, what is this about? It was the end of it is, it was enough to be very frightening to me to learn about divisions among people, because I grew up in this sheltered, little, wonderful community. My father's closest friend was Shlomo ben Israel, and they lived down the street from us. And Shlomo was a reporter for the Jewish Daily Forward, which goes down in history as the Jewish Daily Forwards. And so when the war ended, he was very active. And so we took people into our house as a kind of railroad to going on to something else. And we had a tiny apartment, so my sister, and I don't remember anything. I just remember being frightened because there were strangers in the house, and also I remember vaguely the way they looked.
Now you had a brother and a sister, and everybody was born already when you moved to Dallas?
No. The sister was born first, and she was born in Boston. The brother came along, I think, at a critical time in the family's life. I was 13. She was 18 or 19. She had gone to Israel as a 17-year-old. On the ship coming back from Israel, she met her then husband, who was an Israeli Sabra, who was at MIT, coming for his master's from the Technion. So, and my brother was born as a kind of, probably a change of life baby. Unfortunately, was born with a gene that wasn't discovered until he was probably 6 or 7, and began to have terrible headaches, maybe even older. And he had something called Wilson's disease, which is a genetic, not specifically Jewish, but it's a genetic illness that attacks the central nervous system and does not allow the body to metabolize copper. So he lived a sad, complicated, difficult life, and he died about 5 years ago.
Now, coming to Dallas, was that a culture shock for you from Boston?
Oh no, it was just, it was horrible. I was so ill-equipped. I on so many levels, because I made friends. They're still friends today. I had some wonderful friends. But the name of the game in Boston was not ever what you owned or what you had, and it still is the same. It's how smart were you? So I was very adept at the smart game, and the rest of it was like, whoa. And I lived a very sheltered life.
Now, Samuel, where is he from?
Oh, he's from Dallas.
He's from Dallas.
Is it he's fourth generation? He'll tell you his great-great-grandfather is buried here.
And what business was he in?
His family were poultry processors. From 1890, his grandfather went out to Texarkana with a push cart. I'm sure he got it. He had a horse because there weren't cars even then. And he exchanged, well, you'll get all of this, but he exchanged calico for chickens. And that was how Ablon Poultry was established.
Right. Okay. What was the happiest time in your life?
Oh, if I had to think about that, I think it was probably as a child, living, playing hopscotch, riding my bike, playing on the street till dark. I equate happy with carefree. I loved my children. I loved being a mother, even though we had challenges. But the most carefree time, as I described Brookline and how comforting that was too, to have this family. And I have always been all my life an observer. So I was a participant, but I always observed. I was always
So the 40s was your favorite decade then?
Yeah, by that time I was 6 or 7.
Now, in your lifetime, there's been so many inventions, advancements in technology. What came along that you saw that you go, wow, how'd we ever live, without that?
We lived such a simple life in some ways. I remember when my father got a radio for his car. It was like huge. It was huge. And when we got a television, it was huge. All these things coming out. I am a lifelong reader. Reading is my passion and my love, and I was a reader as a child. And so I was excited by these things, but television never held me. It doesn't hold me today unless it's something amazing. I would rather read.
Tell me about your involvement with the Jewish community.
That I went to graduate school on a scholarship from the Jewish Federation to work in community centers. I'm not a joiner. I belong to NCJW. I support everything. I'm fervently concerned with Jewish causes and issues, but I'm not a joiner.
Okay.
So I've been, again, sort of more of an observer. In my later years, I've become much more. We're Temple Emanu-El members. We're very committed to Temple, but Temple has a very small service, and that's very participatory, and that's the service that I'm connected to. And the reason is, I'm sure, because it reminds me the most of my grandmother's shul, with the women on one side of it. But I would not be comfortable in an Orthodox community.
Now, in your lifetime, you've lived through so many momentous occasions. Of course, you were a small child with World War II, President Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War, the moon landing in '69, something good for the first time, and of course the tragedy of 9/11. Was there something on the national scene that came along that you know exactly where you were the most?
Oh, yeah. I knew exactly where I was when Kennedy was shot because, I was a Dallas person, and I was standing at the Marshall Montefiore Community Center at the desk talking to Regina when the news came. And, 9/11 was exceedingly painful, and on so many levels. And we don't watch very much television, so we really didn't know very much about it. And a daughter called and said, "Have you turned on the news?" And our youngest child lives in New York. And I tear up when I tell this story. So here is the youngest daughter, and the oldest daughter somehow or other gets through to her. And she is downtown going to her dermatologist, who is like 3 blocks away from 9/11. And she called, the older daughter gets through the younger daughter and says, and the younger daughter is like, you know, what's happening? Where am I? What's going on here? And the older daughter says to her, turn around and go walk uptown. That's where you need to be. And that's exactly what she did. So this older daughter, younger daughter relationship is really, to me, is pretty spectacular.
Now, you and Samuel have the 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son.
Correct.
You have 4 grandkids.
Right.
What advice does Grandma have for the next generation?
Live life fully. Be present in your own life and in the lives of others. It can never be all about success and money. It has to be about who you are. Build a self that will sustain you.
Thanks for doing this today.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity.